Hi, welcome listeners. Welcome back to the Fraud Technology Podcast. And today we have a renowned guest. Is over 2 decades of experience again. We've been seeing a lot of experienced people in the last few round of interviews, and we have with us Blair Ramsey. He has been in this fraud industry for almost 2 decades, and it's a pleasure to have him here. Welcome to the podcast, Blair.
Thank you, Ravi. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure is ours as well. So the first thing that I wanted to understand from you is you work predominantly in the ops space of fraud itself, right? We've talked to a lot of people on the technology side, but you're probably the first one who has a lot of experience in the operations side itself. So, wanted to understand a little bit about how ops is structured, what are the day-to-day nuances of an fraud ops team, and what are the kind of success factors for a ops team itself. So would love to understand a little bit about how ops are done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it varies between industries, and I think it varies
Hmm.
between institutions. If I look at it from a macro level,
Hmm.
Ravi, you can
Hmm.
have everything that's insured. So from your upfront fraud detection through to investigation
Hmm.
and um, disputes and chargebacks versus
Hmm.
maybe a slightly different approach where you have some of your functions are onshore, domestic US, and then you have some of
Hmm.
your back office support functions, maybe offshore in places like India or the Philippines or
Hmm.
such.
Hmm. Okay, so sounds like a kind of a BPO or a call center kind of a setup, right? Maybe it's not a call thing that is happening, but it's more like a BPO or a KPO kind of a process where you have offshore level 1 support being done by countries like in India and Philippines, whereas level 2 and 3 is being done in US.
Yeah, that's
Is that understanding
yeah,
fair?
that's
Hmm.
definitely one of the approaches you see, and no, clearly that's
Hmm.
uh, an expense OPEX related
Hmm.
um, move.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think as things change, as regulations change, then you do sometimes see a little bit of swinging back and forth depending on where the appetite is and where fraud losses are.
Understand. And when you're doing this, so for example, in a call center, I can imagine where somebody requires a customer requests something, and they call the company, and then it gets routed to a call center, right? So in your case, what is a trigger? What is a trigger for a fraud process to start? Is it like a internal system raising an alert, and then it goes to the system? So what is a trigger for your fraud ops team?
It's a great question, Ravi. It can be triggered by multiple different things, right? I think the first and foremost, it can be triggered by the customer themselves, right? They
Hmm.
see a transaction on their account and they don't recognize it, so that becomes a phone
Hmm.
call type communication. But it can also be triggered by internal risk rules. Right, so we'll set
Hmm.
up rules based on events, historical events, and patterns to determine whether or not
Hmm.
that particular transaction is a normal type transaction for that individual, or if in fact there's something
Yep.
that's
Hmm.
suspicious about it.
Hmm. So one is I'm assuming when you say customer triggered, something like a chargeback would be a customer triggered transaction because the customer says I don't recognize this.
Correct.
Okay, and the other one is generated by the system itself. And the other fact that I also know is the fraud monitoring tools that are existing in the market do generate a lot of alerts, a lot of them being false positives, even to the tune of 99%, right? So wanted to understand, because when it's a chargeback, there is a particular case that is happening, it has to be resolved, it is real, some disposition has to happen for it. Whereas when it comes as a trigger from the system, it can be like number of customer queries can be probably predictable, but the number of alerts that are coming in, I don't know. I wanted to understand your perspective of when alerts are generated by the system versus by a customer. How does it impact you as the ops team itself?
It's a large trigger for a lot of the work that we get. And you're right, there are degrees of false positives that exist within that population of
Hmm.
work, right?
Hmm.
But it's definitely about in all the organizations I've worked for, is definitely about educating the customer that they may receive
Mm-hmm.
notification alert as a result of our
Mm-hmm.
ongoing monitoring for their security. So
Mm-hmm.
they tend to be okay with the false positives when you educate
Mm-hmm.
them from that vantage point. And obviously,
Mm-hmm.
it's an ongoing analysis, it's
Mm-hmm.
ongoing movement. So we're always looking to reduce the false positives. When people travel,
Mm-hmm.
when people shop at
Mm-hmm.
stores or spend larger amounts on transactionally than they normally do, we try to educate them on giving us advance notice so we can allow those to go through versus them getting
Mm-hmm.
declined because it exceeds their spend
Mm-hmm.
limit. So I think the short answer
Mm-hmm.
is it comes down to kind of that
Mm-hmm.
ongoing customer education and the ongoing customer
Mm-hmm.
knowing your customer and letting them know that you're there for ultimately their security.
Understand. So I'm probably understanding this. I want to clarify if my understanding is right. So what you're saying is when alerts are generated, they don't go necessarily directly to the fraud ops team. First, they go to the customer for them to say whether that alert is genuine or fake. And based on what their input is, it then goes to the analyst team or not. I'm assuming that's what is the
Yeah,
process.
correct, correct. So the rule kicks out.
Mm-hmm.
It'll trigger a notification
Mm-hmm.
alert text message to the customer.
Mm-hmm.
The customer can then verify
Mm-hmm.
whether or not it's a genuine transaction, and then based on their response, it
Mm-hmm.
will then go down a path of
Mm-hmm.
requiring additional due diligence or get accepted
Mm-hmm.
and put to rest.
Mm. So in this case, if it's a text message, right? Assuming the customer received it and he or she saw it and decided that it's a genuine transaction that I'm doing, most of the time they don't do anything. If it is something that they see as a flag, they will right away call, right? So there is an action from their side right away. If it is not a false positive, it's a true positive, then it's likely that they will call you back. But it's a false positive. It may be scenario that I have not checked the text message, or I have checked it but not responded to it. So how do we know? Because I'm asking this question not as a theoretical question, because I remember when I lived in Singapore, there was this fraud that happened where a bank sent a text message, and either it was routed or the hacker had blocked the telecom OTP itself, and so the customer did not receive it for a long time, and the bank assumed that they received it and didn't say anything, so they assumed it was a genuine transaction and went through. So in this scenario, right, not receiving a feedback from the customer could be assumed as that there's no problem, right? But in some scenarios, maybe they didn't even receive it. So how I wanted to understand how is there like I'm assuming if there is an app, you can also send a notification. In the notification, there can be a yes or no approach, basically, right? So I wanted to understand when it is going to the customer, what if the customer does not respond? What is it taken as?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there's a couple of different
Mm,
tactics that can be used. You know, so if it's highly
mm,
suspicious, such as a high risk country, then we can definitely freeze the account
mm,
until the customer contacts us if they're
mm,
choosing not to respond at that
mm,
moment. Um,
mm,
we can
mm,
assume no contact to be good until they contact us. Now, the beauty that a customer has is that they have some
mm,
pretty long timelines to be able to file
mm,
chargebacks and disputes. So, whereas they may not see or respond to a text message at the moment it's sent,
mm,
they have multiple
mm.
months to file, right?
Claim
And
chargeback.
then I
Mm,
think it comes down to the last thing I might say on that is, you know, that ongoing education, right? So we would encourage customers to review their accounts and their statements on at least a monthly basis, if not more frequently, so that it becomes a two-way
mm,
relationship. If we know that you're
mm,
constantly checking and we are trying to
mm,
give you the notifications, at some point you'll notice that there's
mm,
something unusual about your account. Now, the only exception
mm,
to that I might say, Ravi, is that in instances of full
mm,
account takeover, where the fraudster has taken over
mhm.
the account and all of the
Account.
maintenance, the
Mm,
email and the phone number, that can
mm,
definitely occur. And obviously, we would have
mhm,
strategies in place to
mm.
mitigate against that also.
Got it. Got it. Also, in your response to the ops itself, so you talked about analysts and also investigation part of the operations, one investigation typically is not a very structured, because you follow, there's things like, when you watch detective shows, you follow the money, things like that, right? So one is a very, very, very unstructured process, whereas when you're talking about level 1 going to India or Philippines, and then level 2, level 3 going to somewhere else, how do you, one is a volume game, I'm assuming,
Yeah.
right? It's a volume game where economics is important, whereas the investigative part is more, you need more senior people. How do you balance between these two?
So not everything detected requires an investigation. I would start there, right?
Yeah.
It may just
Hmm.
be that, my wife spent money on my account and I didn't know about it. And now I'm getting an alert
Uh-huh.
to say, why's your wife spending the money? Right. So there are genuine
Yeah.
instances of where that happens. Right. So that then takes care
Uh-huh.
of itself. So it becomes a numbers game, right? So it'll be a percentage of the
Mm,
total reports that then go to investigations,
mm,
um,
mhm,
or will be disputes. And then over
mm,
time, and over with the size of our overall
mm,
portfolio, we make analysis on what we think we're going to need to handle X amount of investigations. Right. So if an investigation
mm,
takes 30 minutes to complete, as an example, then if we're going to
mhm,
receive 500 investigations a month, then do the math, and then we'll go from
mhm.
there.
Okay, got it. So, if I understand correctly, so the volume game is to figure out false positives, I'm assuming,
Yep.
right? You eliminate all of the unwanted things which were wrongly generated. And then within true positives, I'm assuming only some of them are investigated,
Correct.
not all true positives. If somebody gets, like if $100 transaction is going south, or let's say even $10, let's say $100 probably is on the higher side. If it's a $10, there's no point even doing an investigation, just refunding it would make sense, because Amazon does that a lot of the time. Because if I tell them that, hey, this food was not delivered correctly, they would not even ask you questions. They would share photos of this. They'll just say it's only $20. Let's just move on, right? So I'm assuming that's also what's happening as well.
Yeah, there's definitely thresholds in place on what makes sense from a
Mm,
break-even standpoint, right? And it does vary.
mm-hmm,
In the financial
mm,
industry,
mm,
that I've seen that be
mm,
as low as
mm,
$25, but in some instances, and at some times of the year, as high as
mm-hmm, mm,
$150. Right? So you think
mm. Oh
about your
wow. Mm,
traditional US Thanksgiving Black Friday shopping period,
mm,
that's going to generate a lot of transactional volume. So turning the dials, I like to think
mm,
of it as turning the dials on the oven, right? We can turn the
mm-hmm.
dials
Oh wow.
based
Mm-hmm,
on
mm,
where we want it to be so that we can control the volume.
mm-hmm. Okay. So if I'm getting that right, so now I'm going to the part of your KPIs and how you operate. Obviously, I think that it would be considered a cost center to the company, and so the business teams would obviously have pressure on you to finish the investigation as soon as possible, because the customer service is obviously pressuring you, when is this going to finish, right? So what are the business pressures for the ops team itself when it comes to operating in the fraud ecosystem?
It's an interesting one that I've often had some real good conversations on. Because
Mm,
there's clearly pressure from a core KPI standpoint, and in an operations
mm-hmm.
center, it's typically how much can you get done in how little time, right?
Yep.
Number of units
Mm-hmm.
per hour, number of units per day, whatever, right? But I think the counterbalance to that is, while it is still a fair way to look at it, if I'm going to take a little bit longer to save the organization money, and that money is
Mm-hmm.
multiple X of millions, then I would debate with
Mm-hmm.
anyone that,
Mm.
it's a worthwhile investment to take a little bit longer.
Okay. So you're basically calculating ROI,
Yeah.
essentially, that you're saving this many dollars and this is my cost. And that is how it makes
Yeah.
sense. But on a day to day basis, is there like, I'm assuming between, let's say, customer support, when they raise a ticket to fraud team does the investigation, I'm sure there are SLAs within all these processes, so that they can communicate to the customer as well, hey, we'll need 2 3 days to do this, and we'll get back to you, something like that, right? So what are these kind of SLAs that exist in this ecosystem?
So Yeah, you're 100% correct. There are key metrics like SLAs, productivity,
Mm,
things like
mm,
that. So
mm,
there obviously are
mm,
averages, but from a customer
mm,
contact standpoint, we normally try to give a cushion of,
mm,
anywhere between 1 and 5 days. But
mm, mm,
we've balanced that off in the past by providing conditional credits to the customers, right? Because as a
mm,
customer, if you have fraud on your account, my experience has been that
mm.
the only two things that you're worried about is, am I going to get my money back or am I going to be charged interest for it,
Yep.
right? Number one. And
Mm,
secondarily is, do I need to get a new card because my original card details have been compromised? They're the only two things you're
yep.
worried about. They're not, the
Mm,
consumer is not worried about our internal processes on our internal
yep.
SLAs, right?
Agreed.
So if we can handle
Yeah.
those two things up front and immediately for the customer at the detection stage, everything else doesn't matter
Mm,
to the customer at
mm,
least,
mm, mm,
right? And then we can
mm,
back into, whether it is 3 to 7 days, 3 to 10 days, whatever that SLA is to finalize the investigation. We'll deal with that
mm,
internally. Now it is important because clearly it
mm,
becomes a cost item for the business,
mm,
but
mm,
when you put the
mm,
customer front and center, the only two things they worry about are the
mm.
two things I mentioned.
Okay. So just to reiterate, the two things that, from a customer standpoint, is what we need to address is one is, am I going to get my money back, right? And second one is the card that I'm using for this transaction, whether I want to change it, whether I need to cancel this one and then get a new one. Okay, fair point. I guess from a customer standpoint, true, true. Whenever I had some sort of a transaction happening, I think most of the time I called up and then they'll say either cancel the card, or in the first call itself they'll typically tell you, no, cancel this card. I'm going to cancel it, or they will tell you already that I'm going to cancel your card. I'm going to send you another card. And then whether they confirm the money or not, I don't remember. That I don't remember. But yeah, good point that you reminded me that in my own experience, it happened that
And
way.
you
Okay.
know, Robert, in
Yeah, go
some
ahead.
in
Sorry.
some
Mm,
instances, at the point, if so, there's a notification feature set up. In some instances,
mm,
if you indicate that you don't recognize those charges, that, depending on how sophisticated the technology is in the institution, that in itself can be enough to trigger the new card being issued.
okay. So it's automated
In some
altogether. The
instances,
decision and
yeah.
yeah. Okay. Okay. Got it. Got it. I think the first time I complained, I think it was not right away given as a card. But the next time I complained about a similar transaction happening, then they canceled the card automatically. They didn't even ask them. But the first time I think it happened, they were like still trying to figure out whether it's true, whether it's a real fraud transaction. And then the second time, I think they could see the transaction being very similar to the previous one. So I guess the decision was simpler in that sense.
Yeah, it does vary from
Okay.
institution.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'm guessing even different times the customer comes also changes as well, I
Yeah.
guess, because the risk changes. If one transaction happened the first time, maybe low risk, but the same transaction happened the second time, then you have a higher risk, then you change the card basically, right? One thing that I also wanted to understand, because there is a lot of talk about generative AI, there's a lot of talk about tech, right? But you deal in people, right? Fraud ops, at the core of it is people, right? So, and I personally am a strong believer of, no matter how great AI is, you still need to have a kind of a balance between a human mind versus a AI itself. And I wanted to understand from you, how does this coordination, how does this give and take? For example, there is something that the human has to, obviously has a lot to offer to AI, and obviously AI has a scale that a human probably can't do. And I wanted to understand from your perspective in the fraud ops itself, how does this play out?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Ravi. There's some really great tools on the market currently that provide those
Hmm.
capabilities. So you think about AI, you think about machine learning, and then I would almost
Hmm.
complement them with a third that I find really interesting, and that is consortium level data, right? So you have providers
Mm-hmm.
in the market today that may have 5,000
Mm-hmm.
customers globally that then have multiple millions of customers that use their product. And if you
Mm-hmm.
buy into that consortium level type platform, you're getting the benefit at a macro level of that consortium data.
Mm-hmm.
So if the overall consortium data says that Blair has a risk score that is above where the organization's acceptance is, then I get the benefit of that as a customer of that consortium platform. So I think the AI, the machine learning, and the consortium data are really critical at this point. But you're right. I think what it does is it definitely automates and optimizes much of the functionality, but you still need an
Mm-hmm.
element of human touch to
Mm-hmm.
do some of the investigative type work.
Mm. So when you say you still need human touch, in what aspects of it do you? Let's say I'm assuming, right, when a system generates alerts, when a human says that it's not a true alert, claims that it's false positive. I'm assuming all these inputs are going into the system, and then it gets optimized. So I wanted to understand how does human uh, human touch help essentially.
Because I think you've still going to have those um, false positives within the
Mm,
consortium level platform or AI and ML
mm,
platforms.
mm,
So, I think that there's going to be instances where you may still need to make a judgmental manual decision that it may be
mhm,
an exception, right? Um,
mhm. Yeah.
so I think there's still an element of that exists. And then I think that the second
Mhm,
part of
mm,
it is from a support standpoint of, you still need somebody
mhm,
to make the adjustments and write the rules that then are specific to
mhm,
your
mm.
organization.
So when a decision is being made that this transaction is fraud or not fraud, right? Is there a regulatory requirement, or maybe there is no clear black and white rule like that? But is it looked down upon if a system makes that decision?
No, it is not. In fact, if you move away from kind of the financial sector and
Mm,
maybe use
mm,
the online sports betting and gaming sector, which I've also had some
mm,
experience in, that becomes a very
mm,
jurisdictional based scenario,
mm, mm,
particularly in the
mm,
US, where it is um, each state has to have independent regulatory approval. So geolocation
mm,
data becomes critical in that instance. Um, but you
mm,
can still
mm,
utilize the automation within the system to make those decisions. You just have to write your rules
mm.
slightly different by state.
So my actually next question was around fraud in the gaming
Okay.
space, because I noticed that you worked in the gaming space itself. So I wanted to understand in the financial space. I know it's a very heavy industry which focuses, and there's a lot of talk about fraud, and even fraud and compliance getting merged and things like that. There's a lot of attention, money, and effort going into it, right? So wanted to understand in other industries, and especially because you worked in the gaming industry, how that plays out. What does even a fraud mean? I only remember when I think of gaming fraud. I don't know if you watch Big Bang Theory. There is this one episode where somebody steals in the game. I win a sword, and somebody hacks my account and steals that sword in the game itself. I'm guessing you are talking about betting industry, but in general, gaming, online gaming industry itself, there could be account takeovers and somebody stealing some assets from your account. They may not be money, but assets that were under your account. So I wanted to understand how the gaming industry itself is structured.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because there's there's some there's definitely some correlation between the financial industry. So if you think about
Hmm.
your traditional ATO type fraud, um,
Hmm.
definitely can
Yeah.
exist, right? I think there's definitely
Hmm.
a big play on the identity piece, the identity fraud, right? Because a lot of the gaming industry is through mobile apps and online logins. So if I can
Hmm.
steal and create a login with your identity, then I can certainly go that. And then I think the other two that I would probably call out are fraud by way of um, stolen
Mm,
stolen credentials
mm,
for credit cards. So I
mhm,
go on the dark web, I buy
mm,
a credit card in your name, and then I use that instrument to load
mhm,
my online betting account, and then I can win
mhm,
money with stolen money and then take it out and
mm,
disappear to the sunset, right? So I think that that's definitely a thing. And then I think the last one that I might mention in this space from a type
mm,
of fraud is probably related
mm,
to what I would call your equivalent of buyer's
mm,
remorse, right? So
mm,
in the financial industry, you go, you buy a new jacket or a new pair of jeans or something, right? And then you decide, oh, I don't like it, I
mm,
want to take it back. Yeah. Whereas in the gaming
mm,
industry, you have that
mm,
people lose money and
mm,
then they try to claim that
mm,
they weren't the ones that spent the money.
mm,
Right? Somebody
mm,
hacked my account. Somebody, this wasn't me. My
mm,
credit card was stolen. So you see a lot of
mm,
that from a buyer's remorse
mm,
standpoint.
mm. How do you identify such a thing? I mean, it must be very hard, no? Because if I change my mind, it's in my mind. I want to understand how would you go about detecting something like that?
Yeah, I think it depends on how sophisticated you are with your tools, right? So, if you register for a
Mm,
particular platform and we've got your device ID and your NEIM number from your device, and we've got biometrics,
correct. Mm,
right? And you've
mm-hmm,
played with us before using that instrument, and it's within your typical
mm,
pattern. Like what I'm doing right now
mm,
is I'm creating a
mm,
profile of Ravi and what he
mm,
typically has done and the behaviors he
mm,
typically has. So if you come back to me and say, well,
mm,
I don't recognize that $10, that wasn't me, but you bet $10 every Saturday on that same device and have
uh,
done for the last year, then
uh-huh,
my ability
uh,
to challenge the chargeback gets stronger, right? Because I can
mm,
demonstrate linkage
mm,
that it was you.
mm,
So there's
mm,
definitely pieces of data that you can submit from a compelling evidence as part of
mm,
the challenge to the chargeback
mm,
that will help your case
mm,
in winning it.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Understand. And typically in the financial services space, so from a customer standpoint, I'm also very serious about my credentials. I don't share my banking credentials or even the passwords. I don't replicate anywhere else. But with gaming, I'm generally very loose about. Sometimes I don't even use my own credentials. I even have a secondary email just for that sort of a thing, so that I don't have to use my primary email for these kind of things. So what is even a recourse? So for example, if the gaming company decides that this is what's done by you, what would a customer be able to do?
Yeah, I think you see a lot of that in so much as, I think you would call it probably something along the lines of social gaming, right? So Blair gave
Mm-hmm.
Ravi his cell phone and said, "Hey, go use $100 on whatever," right? Um, or I
Mm-hmm.
gave you my credit card. I said, "Go spend $100, enjoy yourself," right? That
Mm-hmm.
definitely exists, right? So there are some strategies that you can put in place up front from a verification
Mm-hmm.
standpoint that will help you. Now, it will not
Mm-hmm.
100%
Mm-hmm.
hit it, but it will certainly
Mm-hmm.
help. But at the end of the day, it comes down to they have the ability under the Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express rules to file a chargeback, right? So even though
Mm-hmm.
you and I may be friends and we may have agreed that you can use my stuff, I can still file a chargeback. So there is a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
an opportunity there to close.
Mm-hmm.
But then you go back into the previous items I mentioned, and that is um,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So you placed a bet at this amount, and it was on the same device that you've always used, and it's with the card, and it's the same IP, and it's the same geolocation. You start to back into some of those parameters, and you build your
Mm-hmm.
case around that.
Okay, understand. So you talked about identity fraud and a few other frauds. Few of the other frauds being a little more relevant to transactional level. So I wanted to understand: is identity fraud an issue in the financial services space? because you do KYC, obviously, but is that still a problem?
Yeah, I think it is. In fact, I might say it is the
Mm,
biggest part of the problem. In my experience, I
mm,
think if you if you let the bad guys onto your platform, then they can do what they
mm,
want to do. If you can prevent them at
mm,
the start of the process in
mm,
the identification or the
mm,
biometrics, and you weed them
mm,
out at the start of the process, then they don't even get an
mm.
opportunity to come in and do bad things.
Hmm. You talked twice about biometrics. You talked about biometrics in the gaming industry as well. So you're talking about facial biometrics for creating accounts, like liveness detection
Yeah.
and taking pictures. So that's what. Oh, okay, okay. I come from that industry, so I was
Okay.
like just confirming. Uh, so good to hear that because I see in the US, face biometrics is not as popular as the rest of the world, actually.
Yeah, I think much like the chip and card, so chip and pin on your card, the
Mm,
US have lacked a little bit,
mm,
but it's definitely
mm,
a what I would call a saturated element of the market. There's a lot of good companies out
mhm,
there and a lot of new ones coming on board into the market in the
mhm,
last
mm,
probably 3 to 5 years. So I think they're starting
mm,
to get it that it is a critical piece.
mhm,
But I would agree. I think there
mm.
are areas that are more advanced than the US market.
Yeah, so that was my first surprise when I was exploring face biometrics in the US market, is because that has become more or less a gold standard in the rest of the world, for especially the developing countries, because where the identity is a big question mark. So you take face biometrics and compare that to the ID document. So that's been pretty popular, basically. And I was surprised to learn that in the US that's not a standard practice, and very few companies do actually do that. Okay, so one of the questions that I wanted to understand is obviously you have the ops team, and you have the global operation in place, right? So how do you manage the global aspect of it? I also have, I mean, I also want to tag that along with what I have known is if if within the first day of the transaction being a fraudulent transaction, if you can get onto it in the first day, you have a higher chance of recovering it or doing something about it. The more time you take it, the money is lost, right? You may decide that it's fraud, but you will never be able to recover the money itself. So I want to understand, given the global nature and the time zones and the time sensitivity of you need to respond back as soon as you can, how do you optimize all of this?
I think so. Earlier in the conversation, Ravi, I talked a little bit about two different models. The first being onshore model completely in the US, right?
Mm,
Now, unless
mm,
you've
mm,
got round the clock, 24/7, 365 operation, right, which
mhm.
is the case in some instances, that becomes a very
Mm.
expensive model, right? But I think
Yeah.
that's then where you can
Mm,
optimize from a revenue standpoint and having an partial offshore model. So it'll keep costs down, but
mhm,
it will ultimately still give you that round the clock visibility to where
mhm,
you can
mm,
detect or act upon fraud early versus letting it wait until the
mhm.
morning.
Okay. Okay. Understand. Understand. Okay. So I think that more or less summarizes most of the questions that I had for you, Blair. It was a pleasure talking to you. I mean, I understand fraud technology a lot better than fraud operations itself, and it's been a pleasure to learn more about the ops teams and how they're structured. What are the pressures of the team? And so nice to have that conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a nice day,
You too.
Blair.
Bye bye.